And I ended up home that summer, and I can't remember who it was. Tatum and I had this discussion yesterday, but I can't remember who the person was, but somebody came up to me at like a restaurant or something, and I had this cool bucket hat on, and they're like, dude. Well, they didn't say dude back then. I think it was like, man, yo, what's up with N.W.A, bro? You know, whatever. And I'm like, I don't know. It's just a hat, right? And they were like, bro, come on. They're awesome. Do you know what this represents? Are you representing? I'm like, I'm not representing anything. I'm just a guy out of college who's home for the summer wearing a cool hat, you know? Anyway, as it turned out, this person informed me that what it stood for, and at the time I was like, "Oh, okay, that's really provocative." I'm not trying to be provocative. I just want to fade in. I just want to blend in and enjoy life, and I don't want to be perceived as this radical guy that was part of this movement, right? And that's kind of my experience with N.W.A. And from that point forward. I've never, and Tatum will attest to this. I'm not a big rap guy. I'm not, plugged in with the inner city struggle, at all, at the least. We'll get into that more down the road. But anyway, so that's how the whole N.W.A. Straight Outta Compton thing, was shared with me, or how I initially experienced it. So, I'm very, very excited to kind of talk about the developments now that the movie's, been out for a while. And I think it really touches on some chords here that are relevant to society today. So I'll leave it at that.
Did you, after learning what that stood for, did you go and look up any of their stuff, or was it much later that you kind of started to get to know it?
No, I did not. Good question. I really kind of took a back seat and felt that I was, I think at that time of my life, I was obviously a lot younger, and I didn't really want to make waves, because when I found out that they were kind of a controversial band, quote unquote, I'm going to use that term because it's a boomer term, whatever, but a rap band at the time, and it was very controversial. I didn't want anything to do with that. I didn't want to be pegged or slotted or categorized as a radical or some, crazy not crazy, but some inner city struggle, voice. That was not me. So I kind of just turned away from it, put the hat away, and didn't look back. So no, I did not follow up on the music. I didn't follow up on the lyrics. I really, and that was a time back then in the 80s. And I have this on one of the things I wanted to discuss, because it was all about, war on drugs, just say no. This is all before you guys were born. But there was a whole political movement, which I think they touch on a little bit in the film. Not enough, in my opinion. But there was this whole drug thing back in the 80s. And it was a very touchy, kind of sensitive time for inner city youth who were struggling to break out of poverty, and they still are, obviously, today. But anyway, so in a direct answer, no, I did not follow up. I didn't really do any research. I was young. I was having fun, enjoying my life, and didn't want anything that would stand in the way of me getting forward or getting mine. So I kind of just put it on the shelf and let it go.
That being said, though, I mean, you can correct me, but I do feel like even though you might not have engaged with it at the time, I do have memories of you engaging with these things. Maybe as you got older. When I was a kid, I remember you playing Tupac in the house. I remember things like that. And definitely,
the clean version, by the way.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
But, and now that we're older, you are very engaged with these topics and things like that. So, yeah, but not to go too far down that rabbit hole. Before we even, technically, I haven't even announced what film we're talking about today.
No one could possibly know.
It gets in the title of the episode or anything. But yeah, so I guess I'll get the conversation rolling here. But yeah, so today on the show, we will be discussing the 2015 film Straight Outta Compton, directed by F. Gary Gray and produced by Dr. Dre and Ice Cube, among others. The film stars O'Shea Jackson Jr., Corey Hawkins, Jason Mitchell, Neil Brown Jr., Aldous Hodge, and Marlon Yates Jr., who all play the original members of the rap group N.W.A. N.W.A. or Niggas with Attitude released their debut album in 1988, which featured some of their biggest hits, Straight Outta Compton, Fuck the Police, and Gangsta Gangsta. The group released music that shined unabashed light on the racism and police brutality that existed specifically in the neighborhood of Compton in Southern California, but also reflected the realities of many other Black communities throughout the United States. There was much controversy around the group at the time, as many marginalized communities felt empowered and many wealthier white communities felt threatened. N.W.A., though made up of 6 men, launched the careers of arguably their most well-known members, Ice Cube and Dr. Dre. Ice Cube went on to be a screenwriter and actor, while Dr. Dre became one of the most influential music producers of the hip-hop genre, and some would argue of all time. He has discovered artists like Anderson .Paak, 50 Cent, Eminem, Kendrick Lamar, and Snoop Dogg, while additionally producing tracks for Tupac and Mary J. Blige. The legacy of this rap group is undeniable, and unfortunately, many of the realities that motivated their lyrics are still prevalent today. In an interesting coincidence, though maybe not a coincidence at all, Straight Outta Compton, come awards season, was a part of the now famous Oscar So White controversy. In a year with films such as Straight Outta Compton, Chirac, and Creed, not one of them was recognized at the 88th Academy Awards in any major category. The Best Picture nominees featured all white casts, and all 4 acting categories featured not one person of color. Though Straight Outta Compton did receive a nomination for Best Original Screenplay, all of the writers were white. Additionally, out of every single category that year, only 2 featured any African Americans. So, as I hinted before about the difficulty that the nerves that I'm feeling with hosting this episode, obviously there are lots of dynamics to this. There's the movie itself, there's the rap group itself, and then there's kind of the Oscars award side of things when this movie was released in 2015. So we'll do our best to kind of navigate through that as time goes on. But Geneva, can you get us started off by just sharing your overall thoughts on the movie and if you have seen it before?
Yeah, so I had not seen this movie before. I remember that year. That was just I think that was the year actually just starting to get into the Oscars. And trying to watch all the Best Picture nominees. And of course I remember the controversy when it wasn't nominated, not just for Best Picture, but none of the actors were nominated. Which, having now watched it, I think is absolutely insane.
Yes, absolutely insane.
Yes. Anyway, yeah. So I was really excited that you picked this, so I could finally have a chance to see it. It's been on my list for a long time. And it was a bit intimidating, honestly, going in as a person who, as a white woman who has no kind of prior awareness or history whatsoever with rap, with this time period and what was going on. I just don't have any sort of context for it. So it was a little bit difficult at the beginning when I was starting the movie, because there's a lot of historical figures who are depicted and that you're kind of very quickly expected to understand. But yeah, I figured it out. The movie does a very good job, I think, of introducing all of the characters and the relationships to one another and the dynamics of kind of the cultural, political situation that they were growing up in. Yeah, and I really like this movie. I don't think it's without flaws, but it does a really, really good job of kind of shining a light on a situation that people such as myself don't have a lot of awareness of. I think it does a fairly good job, although we can definitely get into it a bit more, but of depicting the kind of complicated legacy of what they were doing. How there's so much that was admirable about the honesty that they had when in talking about their situation, and bringing awareness and just being very unapologetic about the injustices that they were seeing. But there's also a lot of that is problematic and controversial for understandable reasons about the the music that they were writing as well. So, you know, I think the movie does a pretty good job of depicting that. Although maybe it could, there are some ways that it could bring that out a little more. But yeah, overall, I thought it's a really good movie. It does, I think, get a little more. I think it starts very strong in terms of, um, you know, the way that it sets everything up is very just feels very fresh and very exciting and very just layered and dynamic. I think toward the end, for me, it starts to lean a little bit more toward the traditional biopic, you know, musical
Mm.
biopic formula. But that's also just, you know, the reality of how their story plays out in terms of where the screenwriters made the decision to end their story. Um, but yeah, I think overall it's a really good movie, and I'm really glad that it got a Best Screenplay nomination. But I wish it had gotten more. In particular, I was very very impressed with O'Shea Jackson Jr., who I've seen in
Mm.
a few things, and he's always impressed me. And I watched him in this, and I was like, "Yeah, Oscar nomination. Where is it?" And then I looked it up, and I discovered this was, I believe, his first ever movie. Or TV show, like his first sort of major acting job, which is very impressive. But yeah, across the board, the acting is phenomenal. I think the
So
direction
strong.
by Gary Gray is phenomenal. Yeah, so yeah, it was really really good.
I loved hearing those thoughts, Geneva. I look forward to getting into them more as we move forward. So Francis, can you just share your overall thoughts on just the movie itself?
Well, first, I have a question, if I may. Can either of you opine or give me a little background on F. Gary Gray, the director? Because obviously I wasn't following him the first time that I watched it, but I did take notes the second time out, and I thought his directing was, frankly, very, very cutting, and in a good way, right? Um, do we know his background? I mean, has he done any other work since? Was this his first film project? I don't recall.
Yeah, so I've got it pulled up right now. Um
I believe Friday was actually his first directing job, but I might be wrong about that.
yeah,
Oh, he directed Friday. Okay.
yeah, he's also directed music videos for Usher, Dr. Dre,
Huh.
Queen Latifah, Whitney Houston.
Ice
So
Cube.
it looks like R. Kelly, Will Smith, Outkast. So he's directed a lot of looks like hip hop music videos.
Okay.
He also
Okay.
directed a movie with Jamie Foxx called Law Abiding Citizen, which I'm not really the biggest fan of, but it looks like most of his directorial experience. He also directed The Italian Job. Um,
Really?
Oh
Huh.
yeah, the
yeah,
Okay.
remake. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
Sorry, the remake.
He did one of the Fast and the Furious movies as well.
Yeah. So he's kind of all over the place, but it looks like most of his experiences, well, yeah, he's kind of all over the place, but he's directed a lot of hip hop music videos for big names. So, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Um, during that time frame, going back to the mid to late '80s, I believe, and they spoke about this in the film, that Boys in the Hood, which was released sometime before, around the same time, I think that N.W.A became relevant, at least in Los Angeles and on the West Coast. And that movie was groundbreaking. And I'm just talking about, throwing a little pub to Boys in the Hood, which
Lawrence Fishburne.
yeah, which seemed to give some traction, some ground, some degree of fertilization of the soil, so that films like this, or at least the music of that time, could be circulated on a broad media platform, right? Rap was, quote unquote, gangster rap was um, just burgeoning out of the inner city struggle, right? You had your West Coast, and again, I don't know if we'll have time to get into this, but so I'm originally from the East Coast. Spent most of my life in the Midwest, and now I plan on spending the remainder of my time on the planet on the West Coast. So I can safely say that I affectionately identify as bicoastal. Anyway, yeah, so the New York thing, which was this rough, just heavy drum beat. The what was it? The breakdancing music was coming out of New York City, and at that time, after Boys in the Hood, there was this West Coast movement, right? That everybody was hearing about, um, uh, and it was different from the East Coast hip hop, quote unquote, rap scene, because you can tell in the film Straight Outta Compton that the beats are just more guttural. There's more bass. There's a bit more rhythm to it. They're doing a lot more, or Dr. Dre was doing a lot of sampling of old R&B tunes, right, from the '60s and '70s. Whereas in New York, they weren't, for whatever reason. They were just guys on the street who were breakdancing to, beats, whatever it was in the '80s. And then this West Coast thing coming out of Boys in the Hood introduced the world, really, or society, to this element of music that was really, really moving. Not talking about the lyrics, just the music at this point. It was just very catching and very, for those of us that grew up in a black community, whether you're inner city or suburban, the point is we all have those roots, right? And so what Dr. Dre was able to do somehow was tap into that, what we call that old soul music. Tatum will appreciate that. And it has a different vibe, a different sound. And then when you link in the lyrics over that, it's hard to just sit and not move, right? It's a very rhythmic West Coast vibe that was very enticing in the '80s. But anyway, okay, the movie itself, I would say one of the things that struck me was, and one of my last points notes that I took last night when I was watching it was after the sex, the misogyny, the violence, which there's quite a bit. The rule of business always applies, right? Now that I can tap into as a corporate executive, right? Because it's all about product, it's all about market, and ultimately profit, right? And so I think the director did a credible job. Of sort of juxtapositioning that conflict from my standpoint anyway, because you have, these guys are coming from nothing, right? They're genius in some respect. I mean, I'm sure Tatum will end up talking about Dr. Dre and his genius and how he parlayed that into a multi, billion with a B industry from his talent. But again, these guys come from nothing. They lock themselves like many musicians do. It's not just a rap thing. It's all these musicians that are just trying to demonstrate and reflect their art, and they get locked into these agreements without reading the paperwork, or they get locked in with the wrong people, or whatever it may be. So I would say, yeah, I like the movie, but that's one of the reasons why I do like the movie, because it does a credible job of getting because listen, if you watch that film as we did, it's violent. It's misogynistic. It's really disturbing on many levels. But in the end, it's one of its redeeming quality is that the struggle and poverty is real in the inner city, but once you break out of that, then you have a whole nother element of profitability that you have to deal with, because now you're in a whole new different realm from what you were really singing about.
Yeah. Well, that's
If that
something that
makes
really
sense.
struck me watching the movie too. And I think, they had to stop at a certain point, so maybe they weren't able to go as far into this. But the idea that they are sort of um, m- making into a commodity their background of deprivation in a sense, that at a certain point, their background of being impoverished becomes then their selling point. And the sort of they're the rules of where they grew up, and then they're suddenly transplanted into this new world where there are new rules. Like there are multiple times that characters will say, "You're not in Compton anymore. You know, you can't do this. You're not in Compton anymore. Things don't work this way." And so there's that kind of, where they were is the thing that brought them to where they are. But then how does that, how does that affect then the way that they operate in the new surroundings that they find themselves?
So I'll just quickly say I chose this movie to discuss this week, so I think it goes without saying that I really like it. I think I'm a little bit less critical of it than it seems like you two are, and we can talk about that. I mean, I definitely don't think this is a perfect film. I think that with any portrayal of anything, there's going to be bias. I mean, this is kind of a philosophical train of thought, but I don't think it's possible to make anything that's unbiased, even if it's a documentary. So there definitely is bias in this, but that being said, I think that its message is really important, and I think that it's been very, I think that it's been proven in recent years that the messages that these songs and that these artists we're talking about are still relevant today, which is very unfortunate, but also I think it's just good for people to be educated on these things. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily know about Rodney King and what happened with him and his trial. And, people look at George Floyd and they're like, oh, wow, this is a recent thing. And it's like, well, no, like this has been happening for a long time. And this is why people, anyway, I don't want to go like too far down that rabbit trail, but it's like that's why people care so much when these things happen, because we have a track record of people being, let off when they should be locked up, or so there's just a lot of layers to this movie. And also, as my dad kind of hinted at, like the music slaps. The music is just so good. Dre is a genius. I don't know if maybe based off of what the two of you have said, maybe I kind of am the most in the rap scene out of the three of us. I love rap music. I listen to a lot of the artists that Dre discovered and has produced for, even though I know my dad's a huge Mary J. Blige fan. He's always said that. But yeah, I do love rap music. And so I really like the legacy of it. And I like when rap tells a story and when rap has a purpose. Because there is a lot of rap out there, as with any genre of music, I guess, but there is a lot of rap out there that is just, it has no message whatsoever. And I love that this group just talks about a message that's important. And because of that, this movie, I think, represents it really well. So, yeah,
Can I
so
ask
let's
a quick
go ahead.
question about that actually, because the movie, one of the things that's so revolutionary is depicted in the movie about the lyrics that Cube was writing, and the music that Dre was producing, was the fact that it was these reality raps that were really talking honestly about what was going on. So between the two of you, what was rap like at the time? That it wasn't, that this was kind of a shift from what it was before, if you understand my meaning. Because my understanding, rap had not been around very long before that, right? It was maybe only like 10, 20 years old.
I didn't
Go ahead,
do a
Tatum.
lot of, I didn't do like a whole bunch of research on this side of things, so don't like quote me on anything, but from what I think I know about this, I feel like rap music hadn't really crossed over. Like it was kind of something that African American communities knew about, but it wasn't like, oh, everyone's listening to this. But because N.W.A was so controversial, everyone kind of was like, oh my gosh, what is this? And so for
Gotcha.
better or for worse, right? I think people became aware of rap music because of the just kind of the groundbreaking like music that this group was making.
Yeah,
Correct me if
that
I'm
makes sense.
wrong, Francis, but I think that's kind of the way that it works out.
I can concur with a point you made that yeah, it certainly began to cross over. I wouldn't, where I disagree is that it is, N.W.A was not a crossover medium of rap medium. In fact, it was quite polarizing, right? It really, there was N.W.A and there was Public Enemy. I'm sure you guys have heard of Public Enemy. So they were the East Coast and I'm using today's terms, they were, being broadcast as these radical inner city thugs, right? Because they don't fit the mainstream. They're preaching violence, hate the, fuck the police. You could go on and on and on. So at that time, Geneva, yeah, it hadn't gone mainstream just yet. It was still very polarizing. Hence the police, the persecution by authorities, the government interventions to, we've got to shut this down. This is just. It was almost, it's reminiscent of when, and this is before my time even, when Elvis Presley, right, took the stage, and I don't know if you guys have seen that movie, but
I was
maybe we
about
can
to
talk about
say
that
it
another
really
day.
reminded me of that
Oh,
scene in
let's.
Elvis.
Oh, are we really
Sorry.
comparing this movie to Elvis?
No,
Oh,
no, 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 no,
Oh
no, no, no.
we might have to throw down if that's what we're doing.
Oh
No,
boy.
no. But the point is that politically, neither of these artists were embraced by the mainstream, right? That's all I'm
that's
saying.
that's kind of what I meant when I said N.W.A. for better or for worse kind of crossed over, in the sense that, like, I don't think it made it something where, oh my gosh, now everyone's listening to rap music and they love it. I think it was more so people are now aware that this music exists because they have no choice but to reckon with it because it's on the news everywhere and it's a huge controversy around it. So I don't feel like it was something where everyone wants to listen to rap music now because N.W.A. is making music. I think it was just something where it was like, oh, everyone is now aware of this because it's such a big deal that you can't really avoid it. So that's kind of what I was hinting at. But they were a force to be reckoned with, I feel like.
Sure.
But yeah. Okay. So let's kind of jump into the movie here. Because we're already a half hour in and we haven't even talked about the movie. So something that one of the first things I wrote down when watching this movie is I love how this film establishes the characters right from the get-go. I love how it establishes where these men are coming from, right? It's like Eazy-E was slinging dope. He was dealing drugs. That was kind of his way of getting by. And then Dre was trying to get out, but his mom wanted him to have a job, and kind of the shame that he initially felt in, like, abandoning this dream that his mom was hoping she had built for him, and he was kind of paving his own way, and yeah, Cube just kind of coming home from school, writing rhymes and all that stuff, and just being thrown into police brutality that's like literally happening in his front yard. I just feel like the film did a really, really good job right off the bat of just establishing these people, these characters, and where they're coming from, just to kind of give more impact going forward as to, just where they end up, because it's, yeah, just where they started and then where they end up. I think it's a really great way that they kind of balance those two things, and it all starts right here with the introduction. Geneva, did you have any, like, early opening thoughts on the movie?
I mean, like I said, it was a little bit difficult to follow at the very beginning for me, just because there are a lot of characters that this movie is following. There's a lot of people in their orbit that are, I assume if you have any sort of passing awareness of N.W.A. and, the foundations of gangster rap, you'd probably be familiar with the names that are being thrown out, but I wasn't. So it took me a little while to kind of get caught up. But I was very impressed with the, I guess it's sort of styled as a cold open, because it happens and then the title comes up. But just the beginning, when it's Eazy-E coming into, I think it's his cousin's house, which is sort of a
Crack house.
like a drug den, basically.
Yeah.
And then it gets unceremoniously, the door is battered down by a police officer driving a tank of some sort, which, I mean, I can't say I'm surprised, but also it was very surprising. It was very shocking. But Eazy is trying to escape, and it's very well directed, as I said before. It's very suspenseful. So that and that's just a great way, I think, to establish kind of the context for what's happening, and the types of situations and struggles that are going to be outlined more later in the movie. them versus the police, but also them versus sort of their surroundings and the kind of darkness in the the community around them that is pulling them in different directions.
Yeah. Francis, did you have any opening thoughts from the beginning of the movie regarding like anything that they portrayed or anything that you saw, anything like that?
I would only add that the introduction of that initial conflict between the police and the quote unquote drug den, I think is substantive in that it fairly introduces you to the ultimate conflict, and that is life in the inner city, and being a law enforcement officer in the inner city. So
Yeah, I think one of the things
it's
that
an interesting dichotomy.
one of the things that I love about this movie, which is potentially maybe part of the reason why you guys are a little bit more critical with it, I don't know, but I really like movies that show that give credence to the perspective of other people where you otherwise might not have seen their perspective. And I feel like this movie is super important because from the outside you can kind of look at it and be like, oh my gosh, this group is so, they have history of violence and misogyny and all of those things, and that might be true, but also from their perspective and from what they've experienced, their actions are legitimate. And I think that that's a really important thing to recognize when consuming any sort of story or piece of art. You have to, or even just the way that you approach people in society, you have to recognize that they are living the life that they are for a specific reason. They came from somewhere. There's a reason why they're acting this way. It's not just like, oh, we write a song called Fuck the Police because we hate the police just because. It's like, no, there's a, like, that comes from somewhere. Or and so I don't know, I love how this film, kind of like you guys were saying, from the beginning, it just kind of establishes the reality of the world that they're living in. And just this kind of central conflict throughout the movie and perhaps throughout the duration of this rap group. And just that dynamic and that conflict between law enforcement and people of color, from specifically African Americans from impoverished communities, and how those things clash.
Yeah,
And I
mean
think,
the way. Oh, sorry. Finish your thought, then I'll.
well, yeah, I was just going to say real quick that I think a movie could be made that shows the perspective of police officers, right? And that could be equally as important, arguably. But this movie is not about that. This is about showing the experience of African Americans coming from that place. And I think it does a really good job of capturing what their reality is.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one smart thing that the screenplay does it often structures their the moves that they make and the music that they write in this sort of reactionary way, in the sense of like they'll have a confrontation with the police in which they are being unjustly profiled and manhandled, and then you see the cut to them singing "fuck the police," like it's very clearly drawing a line between the two. This is not coming out of nowhere. Like you said, this is a reaction to what is actually happening, the experiences that they're actually having. um, yeah, and I think it's done very effectively. I really liked. This is jumping forward a little bit, so we don't have to spend too much time on this. But I really like the scene in front of their the recording studio, where they're just standing out front doing literally nothing when the police come up and just start manhandling them and forcing them onto the ground. And Jerry comes out and he's yelling at them and everyone is yelling, and one of the police officers is black. And there's this argument that ensues, and you see, you kind of see it from both perspectives, although I say that with the heavy, like, obviously our sympathies are 100% on the side of NWA. We're not we're not with the officers who are treating them this way. But it is this sort of interesting deepening of the context of the time, where there is that kind of cultural divide and that sort of perspective of like, you look wrong, you're the wrong type of person or something like that, and that's what justifies this happening. And so then with that context, we cut to fuck the police, and you completely understand why, you know, why that sentiment would, is something that one that they would create, and then one that would become, from what it seems like in the movie, a massive hit.
Yeah, and I think there's a line in the movie at another point when Dre gets arrested where he gets bailed out the next morning by Eazy-E, and he tells him, he's like, I was literally just standing there. And I think that, like that's an actual line in the script. And I think that that's kind of just a prevalent theme throughout the movie. And
I mean, there's that really upsetting scene where Ice Cube is trying to go home, and the police are, arresting some people in the middle of the street. And just because he happens to walk out of his house at the wrong time, all of a sudden his head is down on the hood of the car. His hands are behind his back. He didn't do anything apart from just try to walk across the street. And then all of a sudden, he's being treated and he's being like a criminal, and he's being patted down, and his parents are like right across the street and they can't do anything. It's so viscerally upsetting.
Mm-hmm. And Geneva, just to kind of lighten it up a little bit, because I feel like since the start of the episode, we've been a little bit heavy. But Geneva, you mentioned Jerry, and I just want to throw out there that I love Paul Giamatti as an actor. Like, I feel like he doesn't really often have starring roles. He's kind of always the supporting. And maybe I'm wrong.
He's like the definition of an amazing character actor.
He is so good. And I feel like I've never seen him in something where I just think, oh yeah, that was all right. Every time it's like, no, Paul Giamatti is so good.
Absolutely. And then, especially considering, I'm pretty sure this is the third thing I've seen him in where he plays a skeezy music manager. Like he just fits that role so well.
Yeah. I just think of him in like this, and then Big Fat Liar. And then Cinderella Man, and I just
watched John Adams, which of course he's amazing in. Yes. He's great.
I think the first thing I saw him in was Cinderella Man, for which he won an Oscar, I think.
Did he? Well deserved.
Yeah. And I also wanted to note, I also love Corey Hawkins. I feel like after I saw Straight Outta Compton,
yes,
I was all in on Corey Hawkins, and I was like, when is this man going to be in something else? And he was kind of like not really on the scene for a while. He was in BlacKkKlansman a few years later, but then I feel like he really started to come to the forefront. I remember everyone was like, who is this black guy singing in the Heights? I'm like, y'all, he was in Straight Outta Compton, and he killed it. Like, you got to trust he's going to be good. And then he was in Tragedy of Macbeth, and I'm just really happy that his career is starting to pick up, because he is so talented. He can sing, he can act, and I think he's going to be in the upcoming version of The Color Purple as well, which I think is going to be a musical. But I think that his portrayal as Dr. Dre in this movie, I mean, all of the portrayals of everybody in this movie are so good. The casting is phenomenal. The acting is great. Hashtag Oscar so white. But yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I shouted out Paul Giamatti and Corey Hawkins, because I think both of them do a fantastic job.
Yeah, I will piggyback that. I'll piggyback that and throw in Jason Mitchell, because he.
Yes,
I think that was his breakout role. And I don't know what he's doing now. I'll have to defer to you guys on the technical merits of filmmaking.
Him.
But
he was on The Chi.
Yeah, he was in The Chi for the first 2 seasons when it was actually a decent episodic Showtime series, and then it turned into a soap opera. But strategically, he left. For some reason, they wrote him out, and I think he's doing other film work now. But big shout out to Jason Mitchell, because I think that was a breakout performance for him in Straight Outta Compton. Very convincing, very sincere, very true. And let's, I'm gonna just, again, on the technical side, I'm gonna throw out some kudos to the hair and makeup team too, only because I'm partial because of my wife. But I mean,
so
that
many
whole
Jerry
period,
curls.
yes,
so many Jerry curls.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's not easy to do, by the way. Not that I ever had it, I didn't, but yeah, that was very true to form for the period. So yeah,
I would love to
shout
see you
out.
with a Jerry curl, with a Jerry curl.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Um, just kind of continuing to move forward a little bit. My dad kind of mentioned this earlier when he was talking about, this music kind of throws back to classic funk and how you can't listen to it and not move, right? And there are so many scenes in this movie of people just vibing in a recording studio. And that has been a fantasy of mine for as long as I can remember. It has never happened to me, but if there's ever a day where I have the opportunity to go to a recording studio where someone talented is making music right in front of my eyes, and I can just like sit there and bob my head and jam, oh, that would be such a dream. But I love how many scenes there are of that in this movie. And whenever those scenes would happen, I would find myself doing the same thing, sitting in my chair, like my head's going back and forth because it's so great.
I love, love, love the scene where um, early on when Cube gets home from school and Dre is there, and I think Easy is there as well. Like they're just in their house, and Dre is like playing this thing that he worked up, and he's scratching, and it's just a great sort of early on indicator of like, oh, this person is massively talented, and it's kind of your first introduction to the type of music that they're going to be performing, and it sounds great.
And I feel like that opening scene where they make their first song, I think it's Straight Outta Compton, where it starts with cruising down the street in my 6'4", where like I just love watching. I feel like that scene in particular does such a good job of portraying Dr. Dre's genius, because it's this scene where Dre is there and there's two other people in the room and Eazy-E's in the booth, right? And Dre recognizes, like, okay, in order for Eazy-E to feel comfortable, everyone else has got to leave. And then he's trying to explain a story of, hey, don't like, just imagine you're sitting in a car. You just talk to me like you would talk to me normally. It's not, don't try and put on like, just be you, be you. And it kind of reminded me of like how directors work on a film set, right? You have to help the actor, the performer feel comfortable and get into that space so that they can perform. And I feel like that scene does such a good job of showing Dre's genius from the very beginning of Eazy-E, who has literally never rapped before, clearly is out of his element. Dre is able to get him to that place where they make a hit song, and I think that is so, so cool. And I love how they had a scene like that in the beginning, because I feel like the rest of the scenes of him, mixing things or producing are very short, or like it's towards the end of the song and it's already been made or something like that. But this shows from the beginning of the beginning how good of a producer he is.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I didn't think of that because you know, Easy E, he sings it the first couple of times, and you can just tell it's wrong. It doesn't sound good. He's not on the beat, he's not feeling it, and everything. And then Dre talks to him, and then he does it, and you hear the finished thing, and you're like, oh, that sounds amazing. They do such a good job of the kind of before and after contrast.
Yeah, I would, looking back at that time frame in the late '80s when I think Tatum touched on it earlier that they were beginning to cross over, so to speak, and it really wasn't rap was not regarded as a mainstream artistic talent, right? It was kind of viewed as, and if any of you here, I mean, I don't have the ability to rhyme, let alone speak to a beat, but it's definitely an art form. It's definitely a craft that has to be worked on and developed and practiced, and hour after hour after hour of putting together and then synchronizing that with some sort of a production of it's there's so much to it, like anything in life, right? Like any genius or any creative type individual. It's unfortunate that it took us literally probably until the 90s. This is some years after, right? N.W.A. and Public Enemy and all that, where it really began to, and I don't really know when, I don't want to get away from the movie, but at some point it went from what they call gangster rap and which I think is an interesting term because really it's reality rap. I kind of like that. I heard that expression, which I didn't pick up on the first time I watched
Yeah,
it
for
when the
sure.
film came out. And then I watched it last night and I was like, oh, reality. Yeah, yeah. It's not gangster rap. I mean, that's the world's or society's spin on it. These are gangs and they're thugs and what they have no place in society. They're a menace. And they're really just telling a story about their reality growing up in the city. And yeah, so anyway, at some point that transitioned into hip hop some years later, and now here we are. But yeah, so
Yeah, and you talking about people just kind of having that talent of being able to just come up with something in the moment and spit rhymes. It reminded me of that scene, which I know this is super brief, but I think that this is kind of the casting of the century. I feel like Lakeith Stanfield playing Snoop Dogg is so unbelievably perfect.
It's so
I like
perfect.
it is absolutely perfect. I think it is the casting of the century. No, like it's just is
yeah,
uncanny how much he looks like him and embodies him and like sounds like him. But anyway, I love that scene when he walks in when Dre's
yes,
got that iconic beat that
yes,
anyone who knows rap music knows it. And he just walks, he's like, let me try something out, okay? And he's like, 1, 2,
one,
3
two,
to the
three, and to
foe.
the foe.
Is at the dough. Like it's so we all like I just love listening to that and just
Death
kind
Row
of
Records that pays me.
seeing
Sorry.
that seeing how that song came to be, because that's a song that I've known forever. And I'm obviously this is a depiction of it, right? I don't know if it exactly happened that way in real life, but seeing that captured on camera of like Dre is sitting there coming up with that melody and that riff, and then Snoop just comes in and is like, hey, let me try something, and it's great.
I love this so much. And can I just say that, like, I was watching it as I watch a lot of my musical biopics, and it's hard because there is a formula that they tend to follow, and
Mm-hmm.
there's only so much you can do to kind of get away with it, depending on kind of the scope of what you want to depict. And so I was watching this and I was like, why is this really good? And something like Bohemian Rhapsody. Apologies to all the Bohemian Rhapsody fans out there, but that movie's
No
not
apologies
good.
needed, Geneva.
Like,
No
what is the
apologies needed.
difference? But I feel like it also, I think, for me, does help that I am, again, don't know anything about rap. You're like, this is an iconic beat, and I have no idea what that song was. I know who Snoop Dogg is,
Wait, you didn't know that
and
song?
no,
Oh my gosh, that's
no idea.
crazy. Did you know California Dreamin' by Tupac? California.
I know the name California Dreamin', maybe.
Oh my gosh, that's crazy.
But I think,
Okay, Geneva, but I got to
yeah.
take exception. You can't throw shade on Freddie Mercury, number one.
No,
But that said,
To be
Freddie
clear,
Mercury is
Queen
different
is
from the
amazing.
movie
Freddie
Bohemian
Mercury is
Rhapsody.
amazing.
oh,
movie Bohemian
the film. Okay,
She's
I got
talking
it.
about
I
the
got
movie,
it. Okay,
not the
okay.
song.
My
The
bad.
song
My
is
bad. My
The
bad.
song is amazing. Yes. No,
Copy that. Copy that.
Wait,
completely
everybody
different
loves Freddie Mercury, one of the most talented singers of the
Oh, he's
20th
my
genius.
century.
goodness, yes.
Another genius. Yeah. But yeah, if you like that, if you embrace that, I would say my first rap cassette. Okay, it wasn't. This is yeah. The CDs came out in the '80s. So, but for some reason, I don't know why I had a cassette because cassettes were convenient back then. But my first rap, quote unquote, purchase cassette was The Chronic, Dr. Dre, The Chronic. So if you go back to the film,
Sick.
and I think
There's that billboard
Easy,
that advertising it.
Easy is driving through the neighborhood, just sort of reflecting on what's going on and how in the hell
He's
did I
cruising
get
down
here?
the street in his 6'4".
Well, yeah, he's cruising all right, but he's also very frustrated because he realizes I'm broke, I'm bankrupt. What the hell's going on? And he sees Dr. Dre's Chronic poster billboard, right? And that's when he's just like, I've gotten so far away and I'm so far removed now from who I am and what I want to be that I've got to find a way to get back, right? And that's when he tries to reconcile, and we know the rest. But yeah, anyway, so that reference to the Chronic is important because that was really after that Straight Out of Compton record. And of course, we know that Ice Cube went on and did his thing, and that's all. We got to talk about Cube, by the way, hopefully before we get off this cast, because he's just, oh my gosh, I could go on and on. But Dre released his on Death Row Records. That was his first release, possibly his only release. I'll have to check that. But an amazing. I don't know if you've heard it. I don't even know if you can find it anywhere unless you're subscribed to Apple, because I think Apple has the rights to it. You can't just pick it up on Spotify, or can you? I don't think you can. If you have access to the Chronic, give it a spin and listen, and just put on a headset and listen to it cover to cover, and it will take you to a place. Frankly, if you don't like it, there's something wrong with you. I'll leave it at that.
Wow.
I feel like that's true for all of the artists here, though. Like, if you listen to a whole N.W.A. album, if you listen to a whole Cube album, if you listen to a whole Dre album, if you listen like any of, or a Tupac album, or a Snoop album, like all of, like, this group is just so iconic. If you listen to any of their stuff, I mean, yes, some of it's controversial, but also it's all so good. The talent that exists in this group and who Dre managed to discover, it's just, I don't know. It seems like magic to me. It seems impossible, but somehow it happened. But yeah, so another thing that I kind of wrote down here is, this is something that I feel like for me, I don't know how many people of color think about this when they watch things, but I definitely do. And it's very impactful for me when it happens. But I love how this movie captures Black culture or African-American culture, and just the fact that being Black is beautiful. Because I feel like Spike Lee has talked about this as well. I love Spike Lee, but he said before that growing up, and this is not me saying like, let's have more nudity on screen because whatever. But I remember Spike Lee said that growing up, he never saw Black women naked on camera, or Black men, unless they were like slaves or something. And he was like, I'm going to change that. I'm going to show that Black is beautiful. Right. And so for me, as I'm not fully Black, I'm mixed, but it's nice for me to see African-American women on screen that are seen as beautiful. Granted, they're not always being treated in the best way, but there is still this idea of, the reason these men want them is because they are attractive, because they are beautiful, because, all of that. And I love the dichotomy of just showing, there's all of this violence and there's a lot of danger for these communities because they grow up in those types of environments. But there's also a lot of beauty too. And there's a lot of camaraderie in the culture and brotherhood. And you see that when Dre's younger brother dies, which is an incredibly moving scene that it moves me to tears every time. I think it's so powerful. And you see them come together as brothers at the end. And, there is so much beauty in this culture as well. So I just love seeing that portrayed on screen, because it's not always doom and gloom of like slavery or we just don't have Black people at all. I just think this movie does a very good job of representing just Black people and African-American people as being beautiful, and there are valuable aspects of that community as well. So I like that representation a lot. I think we need more of it, and Oscar's so white.
There's a great point. That's a great point. Here's the counterpoint. And that is, there is a tremendous amount of hatred and derision within within the Black culture, which I've never understood or fully. I have an idea, but the film does a fairly realistic job of demonstrating the bravado, the false bravado that Black men, particularly inner city Black men, face. Right. The opening scene. He's hey, where's my money? And the guy's like, hey man, you're disrespecting my house. Then it's like, well, fuck you. I'm here to get my money. This is a crack house. It's a drug house. I don't need to respect it. I just want my money. And then of course that evolves into this sort of standoff, right? Face to face standoff. Like, who's going to break first? Who's really gonna upset the apple cart here and really break down and surrender? And of course, then the cops show up, and we move on to the next scene. But that's a real thing in the Black community, which I've never quite, as part of that, I've witnessed it, and it's almost as if this attempt to prove yourself is paramount and the only means by which I can express that is through violence, right? By really showing you that I'm a badass, as opposed to what I believe Cube does. Even though he has his moments, he certainly had a moment when he is like, "Where's my money?" and he blows up, destroys a guy's office, the record producer or whatever. I get that, but for the most part, Cube is portrayed as this level-headed, like, okay, it's going to be like that. Then I'm gonna use my intellect to overcome, rather than be violent and just get up in everybody's face and scream and yell. I could do that, but no, I'm going to take a different approach, and I'm going to use intelligence to dictate my market, right? I that's what I wish we would have more of, instead of, but it might
But
sound a little.
but the fact of the matter is this, like, you could say that we wish we had more of that captured on screen, and that might be true, but also this film is trying to the extent that it can, realistically represent what these men went through and where they're coming from, right? And if you had changed this story, then it wouldn't have been true. And so this is the reality of how these men behaved and where they came from. And I think that kind of what I think that there's this reality of you have to fight for your rights, because if you, and again, like, if you listen to these to the rap music that this community releases, or like Kendrick Lamar or things like that, they come from a place where it's like, I don't necessarily know why we treat each other this way, but this is the world that I grew up in. And so in order for me to survive, in order for me to have some sort of value in my life, because I'm not getting value from my community, from society, from whoever, like, this is the way that this is the only way that I know how to get respect and how to be treated well, even if it's only for a little bit, right? But they're all living this reality of, maybe not all of them, but a lot of these members are living this reality of, honestly, I might not live that long. So if I can just have my respect today, then that's what matters, because I could be dead tomorrow because someone died yesterday or a week before or whatever, And I think
Which is really
I,
sad, actually.
I
Yeah.
mean, yes, but we have to recognize that we don't live in an idealized world. And being a person of color in these communities, especially when the police can be very harsh, that's what you have to do in order to survive. And I think it's, yes, you can ask the question of why does this exist, and you can go back in the history of that and kind of trace it back to other things, but it's not something that you can just wake up and flip a switch and be like, okay, well, I'm going to just change the way that I live, and we're all going to change the way that we live, and we'll be fine. Like, there's a lot more going on here. But
I think
yeah.
that gets to one of the one of the things that was debated a lot, I believe, when gangster rap or reality rap was first coming onto the scene, and something I think the movie gets into a little bit. I wish it had gotten into it more, but when art is depicting violence, what is the line between art should depict violence as a reflection of the reality of the world versus art being something that then encourages violence? Where is the sort of line of responsibility for the artist in depicting something that is true about the world in a way that doesn't then sort of promote or glamorize it, in a sort of negative way. Like, I really like that scene with where Cube is being interviewed by that journalist, and he says, the journalist is asking him all these questions about, like, do you feel bad about doing, see, people say this about your music and that about your music, and how do you feel about that? And he's like, look, man, I'm a journalist. I'm just like you. But then he goes on to say, fuck you, I'm Cube, get out of here. So there's that kind of two sides of it, where Cube does have that very sort of, intellectual, like, I have my reasons for the things that I say, and I have, I have a justification for the kind of out there nature of my lyrics. But then there is also that kind of emotional side of it, of that sort of, like, but I also have to have my sort of respect. I need to be seen by the world in a certain way. And if you disrespect me, then I'm going to, terminate this interview and kick you out of my
Well,
house.
that's not why he terminated the interview and kicked him out of the house. The reason he did that is because he was told that the interview was going to be about Rodney King and giving his insight as to that event and why that mattered and why that was important. And Rodney King is something very important that should be talked about. And he was like, I have a voice. I can speak for this community. And this is what I want to speak into because this matters. And this journalist was just trying to look for dirt. He was like basically TMZ. He was like, no, I just want to talk about like the controversy around whatever. And Ice Cube was like, no, I want to talk about something that actually matters because that's what I was told was going to happen. And if you're going to disrespect this super tragic event that happened because you just want to get dirt to make money and sell articles, then you can get the fuck out of my house. And so I think that that is a completely justified response. And it's not something where it's like, oh, I'm a gangsta. I'm just going to like assert my respect because that's all I know how to do.
Mhm.
It's more so a completely rational, like I would have done the same thing. And I think that it's a completely legitimate response to that scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit complex, which I like, which is he is completely justified in terminating the interview and kicking out the journalist because of what he says. He also does it in a way that is, I think, maybe others would not not have done it in that way. He maybe didn't have to do it in that way, but the action he took was justified given the circumstances.
So let me just say real quick. Something that my dad has said for as long as I can remember. He always says like, "Oh, I'm a pacifist. I'm a pacifist," right? And I feel like Geneva, maybe you identify the same. I don't know. I am definitely not a pacifist. I played ice hockey through college. I'm like, if you mess with me, like I'm gonna drop you to the ground. I'm sorry. So I think that yeah, I just think that we might be coming at this from different perspectives, and I do think like sometimes there is a place for peace, and then sometimes you lose your control a little bit, and like it is justified because your reaction is coming from a place of hurt and pain or feeling disrespected, and you can't. I feel like there's this pressure, especially on the Black community. You see it in Martin Luther King, which is one of the reasons I really respect him because I could not live my life the way that he did probably because it's so hard for me to imagine. But Martin Luther King would say, like, this is not a direct quote, but he would say things similar to, we have to be the bigger person because if we retaliate with violence, then we're just going to perpetuate this idea of Black people are violent and they don't use their brains and they just do this and da-da. He was like, we have to prove them wrong. We have to be the better person. And there's so much pressure on the Black community to act like that. And it's like, we can't be composed all the time. Sometimes it is a legitimate response to be fucking pissed and retaliate. And, if it happens once every 6 years and you've been dealing with shit for 6 years, that's a pretty good track record in my opinion. It's not like Cube's doing this every day of his life, at least not as how he's depicted in this movie. I don't know what his day-to-day lifestyle is, at least back then.
Yeah,
but,
I mean, they depict a few times, but it definitely doesn't seem to be his kind of normal operating mode.
Yeah. But anyway, there's a legitimacy to being passive, but I also think there is a legitimacy to being riled up and aggressive.
Yeah. I mean, Cube is, and I think it perhaps it underscores what I was saying before about Cube. His reaction to that interview really, I feel, demonstrated social intelligence. It was more of a conscious effort that I'm not going to go there with you, pal. I'm just not. So you're looking for something provocative to sell papers or sell whatever what article you're trying to move. I'm here to talk about reality, and if that's not the case, then the interview's done. I think, and that's not necessarily passive. Actually, in many respects, the quiet person in the room is often holds the power, and I can speak to that because I've been there in the corporate boardrooms. I'm always kind of quiet, but you're the one that ultimately is controlling the outcome. And I thought that was a good display of that. And Cube, just in general, I mean, I aside from his rap lyrical genius, he at his heart of heart, is an incredible business person, right? I mean, he went on to, I think Geneva, you referenced it, Friday. That whole series of films. The first two were hilarious. I down the road when it went to the barbershop and all that, it got a little soap opera-ish.
The
But the
first
first two,
barbershop is good.
yeah. But getting back to Friday, I mean that the first one or two. I think I don't know how many did they do, maybe 3 or 4, but the first two are absolutely hilarious. And that was his production about living in the inner city and inner city, living in LA and South Central and but in a comical way so that we could not only feel the pain of the struggle but laugh at ourselves, which I think is important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's such a fascinating character in this movie. He's so multifaceted. Yeah.
I almost, this is something I wanted to talk about. I feel like with this movie, I wish that it was like a limited series, a limited TV series where they had 10 to 15 episodes and each one was an hour long, and really diving more into the backstory of these characters and just how they evolved over time. Because I feel like watching this movie, it ends and I'm just like, I want more. I can tell that behind the scenes of each one of these sequences, there's so much more going on with each of these individuals and in each of their stories. And I think given this is just a film and I think this is what, 2 hours, 15 minutes, something like that. I think that given the time restraint that it had as a feature film, it did a really good job. But I really wish that that the story of these men could be told in a much longer format where you could really get into the details of everything, because there's so much there with each of these guys. Who knows? Maybe it'll happen someday, but yeah, this
Yeah, I wouldn't be
movie left me
surprised.
wanting more.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, even just with their personal lives, at a certain point, Alexandra
Mm-hmm.
Shipp shows up as, I think her name is Kim, who's Ice Cube's wife. And it took me a couple scenes for me to realize that she was a character who is going to stay. She is not really introduced. She's just sort of shows up. But, we sort of see several, some of them have kind of a rotating slate of girlfriends who we don't get to learn a whole lot about, although we do get to meet. I think Tamika is her name. Easy
Yeah,
E's
Tamika.
girlfriend at the time of his death. So I mean, yeah, there's so much more to their personal lives that the movie just doesn't have time to cover, that I would be really interested to see. And of course, there are just all the different kind of business ventures and other musical projects that are kind of obliquely referred to, but they don't have time to go into.
Not to mention that there's 3 other members of this group that
Yes.
are kind of sidelined,
Yeah, which can I say too, I rented this movie on Amazon to watch it, and the Amazon trivia, I swear, like multiple times throughout the movie had a piece of trivia about how MC Ren, I think that's his name, the Aldous Hodge character, is,
Yes.
he's a very influential and well-respected musician in his
Yes.
right. And there's a piece of trivia that would keep coming up about how the real life MC Ren was kind of annoyed by the fact that he's sidelined to being Eazy-E's sidekick in the movie. Like he was
for
very
MC Ren.
Yeah, according to the trivia, he was very complimentary toward the movie, but he was a bit irritated that that's how they depicted him, and it's just a product of time, I assume. You just can't cover everything, but
Like I'm saying, let's get a limited series. That would be so great.
absolutely.
That makes me sad for him though. That's a bummer.
Yeah.
Also, I want to correct something that I said before, because I will not be able to sleep tonight if I don't mention it. I said California Dreamin' before was Tupac song. It's not California Dreamin'. It's California Love. I'm sorry. California Dreamin' is like an old which is also a good song. I've got Well, there is a Beach Boys version, but there's also like another version that's older than that I've got in a playlist somewhere. But yes, California Love. I needed to correct that because that's just ignorance on my part.
Can I ask a quick question about not to go back to Jerry and Paul Giamatti, but I wasn't quite sure in the end how to feel about his character, and so I was just curious to get both your thoughts on. I think I'm maybe predisposed by the casting of Paul Giamatti and by the narrative to believe that Eazy-E is correct that he was cheating them. But then, yeah, I wasn't quite sure that how fully to believe when Jerry says this is just how the game is played. If like, yeah, I wasn't quite sure where the movie ultimately fell on Jerry and whether he was kind of, genuinely trying to help them and maybe just was enriching himself a little too much along the way, or whether he was kind of a creep from the beginning, if that makes sense.
Geneva, I love that you bring that up because I actually wanted to talk about Jerry next, because I feel like we haven't talked about him too much.
We're just
so yeah, so I have a very specific answer to that question. But before I say that, I just wanted to throw out there's one scene where they're all having the first like major concert at the venue where Jerry brings in like another record label guy, record producer, and they're kind of standing there listening, and he's kind of pitching the band to them, and everyone's like, yeah, sorry, no, we can't do it, they're too controversial, whatever. But there's this one song where they're like, do that shit, and he's singing along just like the only white guy in the crowd, and he's like older than everyone else. He's like, do that shit, do it. Like, it's just amazing. I love seeing Jerry just like, he's like, yeah, I can get into this. I can vibe with this. Like, cool.
Yeah, he does genuinely seem to like admire the brilliance of the artists, and obviously he's kind of the first person who really recognizes their genius and the commercial possibilities that it has. So he definitely is really does genuinely able to appreciate this style of music and what they're doing.
Yeah. But Geneva, to go back specifically to your question, I'm not going to say that this is 100% correct. This is just my interpretation. I feel like in that last scene, we get a real indication that Jerry is a sleazebag. I don't know if he necessarily was like that from the very beginning. I feel like he was, in the sense that he delayed a lot, giving the other men their contracts and things like that. But I think the thing that really solidifies that at the end is when Eazy-E confronts him, and Jerry's kind of trying to talk him down and convince him to stay. And he's kind of trying to convince Eazy-E that he's crazy and making all of this up. And I wrote down the line. So Jerry has this pitch and he says, have I covered my own ass? Have I covered my end? Yes. But don't you fucking tell me that I never took care of you. And then Eazy-E kind of goes back at him and goes back and forth with him. And then Jerry repeats the same thing again. Have I covered my own ass? Have I covered my own end? Yes. But don't you fucking tell me that I never took care of you. And so it's like, he's done this before, or it's either he's done this before or he's been waiting for this to happen.
He's been rehearsing.
And he has this, yeah, like he has this script rehearsed of this is what I'm going to say. And this is how it's going to get him to calm down. And so he's like panicking in this moment because he's realizing this whole thing that I've rehearsed that's worked with Eazy-E in the past, now it's not working, but I don't know what else to say. So I'm just going to repeat the same line. But he's almost so delusional that it almost seems like he doesn't even notice that he's saying it a second time. He doesn't recognize that, oh, wow, so I feel like for me, that just solidifies that Jerry is a manipulator. He was not actually genuinely, maybe at some points he was, because I do see points of him having actual empathy, like when the police officers arrest them outside the building and he's like, these men have rights, you can't do this. But I think ultimately it's about making money, and he recognized that Eazy-E is an easily manipulated guy because he hasn't been in this music industry before. This is the first manager he's ever really met who was willing to take him on. And he comes from this place where, kind of hinting at what we said before, he's coming from this place where you have to fight for your rights. You have to fight for respect. And Jerry is the first person to show up and treat him kindly for no other reason than you're a human being, right? And I think that Jerry takes advantage of that and takes it to a place where he really is just being a capitalistic sleazebag, in my opinion. But I feel like that line that he repeats is really the thing that solves that mystery for me.
That's a really good point, because I remember that repetition, and I was wondering if my video had skipped. I'd like jump back 5 seconds or something like that. I was very confused. I think the other reason that I struggle a little bit with knowing how the movie ultimately wants us to come down on it is because I feel like, especially as it goes on, I don't really have a sense of where Eazy-E is in his own life, because Eazy-E is talking about, like, he's constantly short of money and he can't understand why. But he also refers to the fact that he has a lot of children that he's taking care of. It doesn't, the movie doesn't depict him being a sort of creative in the same way as Cube and Dre are, where he's not really, I mean, maybe he is. It's just, I didn't get a sense from the movie that he's like writing lyrics the way Cube is, or, producing the beats the way Dre is. He seemed like more he's just the rapper. And so maybe I thought maybe he just wasn't as able to produce as much, or as much of the same quality as they were. So I couldn't tell whether, to the extent to which he was in that situation because of his own, maybe the limitations of his circumstances, versus because it was Jerry who was, keeping him without money.
Well, I think he was kind of the business voice of the band. He was the one that brought Jerry in. He was the one who had to agree about that other guy who, told Cube that he couldn't get his money, and Cube destroyed everything in his office. But I think Dre even tells him at one point, he's like, you're the financer of this situation. And they keep asking, like, doesn't Jerry work for you? Like, doesn't he work for you? It doesn't seem that way, all of that stuff. And so I think that Eazy-E was someone where he was, from where they came from, he was a businessman, because he was the guy who was dealing drugs. He was the one who was making sure people got their dope on time and their money on time. Like, so for where they came from, he was the business person. He was good at managing that stuff. But then when he got to like the big leagues and actually having to deal with real contracts, real legal documents, he was totally, he was out of his realm. He didn't know how to do it. And so Jerry was kind of this person that he latched onto in terms of like, okay, he seems like he knows what he's doing. He seems like he likes us and like he cares for us. And so I'm just going to trust him, because I don't think he understood it. And Cube says it at some point too, when Jerry hands him the contract. He's like, I can't read this shit. Like, I don't understand this.
Yeah.
And so I think it's that kind of situation of he is the business person. He is the owner of Ruthless. But because he doesn't actually know how to manage it well, Jerry kind of took over, and he just kind of fell into that role and got comfortable with it because he was, quote, being taken care of.
Gotcha. Yeah,
and
that makes sense.
Because they came from nowhere. You also see that scene where they're like, where Jerry hands Cube the check and he's like $75,000, and everyone else took it because they were like, to them, $75,000 is a lot of money. And Cube was like, no, I deserve more than this. And I know that I deserve more than this. Whereas the rest of them, and I think including Eazy-E, he was like, I have so much, so I don't care if I need more. Like, I have more than I've ever had. And Jerry knew that. Anyway, I'm talking in circles, but
no,
yeah,
that's
kind
makes
of
so
like
much sense.
my reading of it.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, especially because it's like Eazy-E and Jerry have that sort of special relationship that Jerry never had with the other members. And it makes sense.
And I think that's intentional.
Yeah, that would then cause Eazy-E to feel like, I don't need to worry about anything, so I'm not going to question anything that Jerry is doing. Okay.
Yeah,
and Jerry knew that, and he took advantage of it.
I don't know if it really was evident, but this is what I took away from Jerry or Paul Giamatti's character, and that is there's an undercurrent of exploitive experience. I think with Jerry's character, in that he's a Jewish male in a industry that is notoriously abusive, right? Whether it's film or music, these industries are just notorious historically and continue to be. It's gotten better, but continue to be exploitive of the artistry, of the management, all for profit, right? And I think somewhere inside he knew that he had to protect himself. He had to cover his own end. He had to extract and to some extent exploit the artist to make sure that they generate the most profit as possible. And along the lines, he gets tied in with this guy who is just obviously ignorant, because they're, what are they, 20 years old at the time when they reach fame and fortune, 25 years, whatever it is, and they're on the road and they're having lavish parties, and they're oblivious, including E. He's oblivious to the expenses that he's running up, right? So I'm not defending Jerry, but I'm also saying I think there may have been an and again, the film doesn't, the director doesn't really tease the whole thing. I'm pulling this out, extrapolating if I can, that maybe there was an internal conflict as a Jewish male who's been exploited throughout his career, that he was trying to protect somehow, some way. But just my spin on it. And I'll say this. There's often, you will hear, there's often parallel consciousness between the Black and the Jewish communities. Historically, because of the levels of exploitation and abuse that they've all experienced. Different levels, but certainly there's a parallel truth there, that we have been, people of color, and I'll just say people of color, which includes the Jewish race, have just been taken advantage of, right, and have had to fight and overcome. So anyway, maybe there's an element of that there too.
Yeah.
So,
well, there's that interesting wrinkle that kind of adds complexity to it, where Cube, during their kind of dis war, Cube has that line where he mentions that Jerry is Jewish in his line in a way that certainly can be interpreted as anti-Semitic, and Jerry picks up on it and is infuriated, and is also infuriated that none of the others really seem to care all that much, or it doesn't really bother them, and so there is that kind of added complexity of that sort of interracial dynamics going on there.
This is why I feel like we need a miniseries. Geneva, I know you don't like Ryan Murphy, but one of the things I love, so there's a miniseries for The People versus O.J. Simpson. And one of the things I love about that series, is it perfect? No, it is. There are problematic things about it, but it takes this very, very intricate case that the whole country was invested in, and it breaks down the perspectives of all of the different people involved. So there's an episode from O.J. Simpson's perspective. There's an episode from one of his lawyers. There's an episode from the opposing side's lawyer. There's an episode about one of his other lawyers. There's an episode that's all about the jury. There's an episode that's all about the judge. Like, they spend an hour on each of the different major components or people that are involved in this major trial. And that revolves around very important issues in this country and racism and blah, blah, blah. So again, O.J. Simpson is very, very different from N.W.A. I am more or less pro N.W.A. I am extremely anti O.J. Simpson. Let me just say that. But I just use that as an example because I feel like N.W.A. is similar in the sense that it was controversial in the country. There's a lot of different people involved in this from different perspectives, and I want to see more of each of them. And I feel like there's so much there to work with. So yeah, I don't know why I keep thinking of The People versus O.J. Simpson, but that's just kind of the comparison that I have with that.
Yeah. And I do need to see that series. I don't really consider, I know Ryan Murphy produced it. I don't really consider it to be a Ryan Murphy series in the same way that Glee, or some of his other series are. I've heard really good things about that series. I do need to watch it.
You also haven't watched the crap, what is it? The Betty Davis.
Yeah, you told me about that one. I do want to watch that one too.
because I feel like you'd love it, and you're like, I won't watch it because Ryan Murphy, and I
I
don't like
never
Ryan
said
Murphy.
I
I'm like,
wasn't going to
Geneva,
watch
like
it.
this show is for you. I feel like you'd love
I
it.
literally never said I wasn't going to watch it. I will watch it.
Well,
Okay.
as long as we're on the topic of series, just real quick before we move on, I just want to throw this out there, and for your benefit, Geneva, perhaps, because coming off of Straight Out of Compton, you may want to give a spin to the FX series, assuming you have Hulu or access to it, whatever, to the FX series called Snowfall, right?
Ooh, I don't think I've heard of
And
that.
it's a I think it's 4 seasons. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, Tatum. 3 or 4 seasons, and I think the final season's coming up next year, and then they're going to wrap it up. But it's really a very, of course, it's not documentarial rather, but it does do a credible job of demonstrating the history of the 80s drug movement in LA in particular. So it's kind of a storyline or a contextual storyline leading up as to what gave birth to N.W.A. Now,
Oh,
and I was,
interesting.
when I
Yeah.
watched the movie last night, when I was watching it last night, I'm like, oh my gosh, okay, I remember. So this was the 80s and the whole drug thing and war on drugs, just say no. And the impetus behind this film really is what happens to a community when it's ravaged by drugs and poverty, right? And so there's a backstory to that, and Snowfall does a fairly credible job and it's a 4 season, episodic FX series, does a credible job of demonstrating that. So give it a spin if you can, if you got time.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
And while we're on the topic of series, another one that I would highly recommend to anyone listening. Francis, I don't know if you remember watching this, but I remember us talking about it because I think it came out when I was in college. But there's an HBO limited series called The Night of, and it's
Oh my gosh, what
about,
was that? Tell me. I remember that name, but I
yeah,
forget what it was about.
it's about like the American prison system. And
Yes,
so
yes,
yeah,
yes.
it's starring
Yeah.
why am I blanking on his name right now? Geneva, what's the actor who starred in The Sound of Metal? What's his name?
Riz Ahmed?
Um Yes, Riz Ahmed. This was kind of his like breakout role. But he gets arrested in New York City and he goes to jail, and it's kind of all about like just the intricacies of what happens inside of an American prison, the alliances that are made between different people in the prison, whether it's a police officer and a prisoner or two prisoners together. And it's so there's like there's rankings based off of social statuses and who knows who outside of the prison, and it's really 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 good. Again, fictional. It's not specifically based in like fact or anything like that, no true events, but it's heavily informed by things that happen, and it shows a lot of different perspectives to the prison system of like these are good police officers, these are bad police officers, these are good prisoners, these are bad prisoner. It shows and gives legitimacy to all of these different perspectives, and does a relatively good job of not saying these are the good people and these are the bad people. Not that Straight Outta Compton is inherently about the prison system. It is in certain ways, but anyway, yeah. So I've kind of gone through all of my specific thoughts when it comes to the movie. Do you guys have any other things you want to say about like any scenes or anything in particular that we haven't touched on yet before I move on to like critic reviews?
Well, I would throw out a little respect for the Chicago White Sox because they were prevalent on Easy
Yes.
Ed. The Sox, the black, well, not black, the black hat with the Sox logo on the ball cap was
Do you know
prominently
why?
displayed throughout the film. I think
What's Eazy-E's relationship with Chicago? I was
it's
wondering that.
it's not. There is none. There was another one. It was there was either Yankees, um, but the White Sox were back then it was kind of this what would I call it? In the inner city, they were considered the radical departure baseball team with the iconic White Sox name. They were a black team on the south side of Chicago, but they were named the White Sox. There was an
Interesting.
element of
That's
controversy there.
cool.
Huh.
And so that they would display these like, yo, what's up? We represent the black community, even though it's
That's awesome.
When you see that logo, many people did, well, what is it? Okay, so it's a baseball cap. What's the big deal? Well, if you know the White Sox, you know you know where it's from. So yeah, it was symbolic.
Me and my dad are big White Sox fans, by the way.
Yeah.
The Cubs suck. The White Sox are the best. My dad would take me to opening day every year for like 4 or 5 years in a row.
Yeah.
It was great.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's such a cool little piece of like, a tribute to the costuming department, that this is just a little piece of, a little addition to the kind of cultural context that the movie is taking place in, just filling in the color of the neighborhood and the culture of the time.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else, guys, before I?
And we can't move on without me just throwing some love for the soul music, the soundtrack, the bass line, for all of these it's just unique to the LA rap scene. At least it was. And it's hip hop now is, you've got a lot of artists that have been doing it forever, but Dr. Dre was the first legitimate rap artist that would use this old school R&B music that everybody loved. I don't care whether you're white, brown, black, yellow, red. It was just the music of our 60s and 70s was like the birth of that entire movement. And he tapped into that and took it to a whole new level. So anyway, I just had to throw that out. Big love for Dre.
Yeah, that just makes me think about, I look forward to the future when we have some sort of incredible movie about Beyonce's life and her career or Kendrick Lamar's life and his career. Cause gosh, both of those people are so iconic as well. And like have changed, just shaken up the world with their perspectives on things and their songwriting and their music and everything. So I am 100% positive there will be some sort of movie about them in the future. Yeah. I hope it happens in my lifetime so that I can watch it.
I weep for the poor actress who's going to have to portray Beyonce in a future biopic.
Maybe it'll just be like O'Shea Jackson Jr., Ice Cube's son. Maybe it'll be Blue Ivy. It'll be Beyonce's daughter, and it'll be fine.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. Anyway, that is extreme tangent, but I look forward to that day. Okay, so I'll just kind of wrap up our discussion of the plot there, and I feel like barely any of that was about the plot. It was kind of just about like
it's about
I don't even know what that was.
The plot. I mean, the plot itself, it is in some ways it is kind of the expected biopic formula. There's the rise and then the fall and the breakup and then they get back together again, or some sort of reconciliation is able to happen. Tragically, they're not able to perform again because Eazy becomes sick and dies before that's able to happen. But at least there are attempts at reconciliation before that. The backdrop of the Rodney King beating and then the 92 LA riots. Is, I think you've mentioned a couple times, that's really huge. That is the LA riots happened just about a week or so before I was born. Actually, I have a newspaper from the day I was born, then that's the front page news. So hearing, so I kind of grew up knowing about it, but getting to hear a little bit more about why it happened and kind of the effect that it was having at the time was really, really fascinating.
I love how they showed that clip of Martin Luther King, which I actually, back when I was on Instagram, I posted on my Instagram in 2020, but that Martin Luther King, in one of his speeches, he says, riots don't come out of nowhere, basically. They come from somewhere. And I loved how they included that in there as well. And there was something else I was going to say, but
I just want to, in the social consciousness aspect of the film, I take strenuous objection, and I didn't at the time when that whole thing went down. Um, but to your point, Tatum, riots do come from somewhere, and it really isn't a riot; it's a protest. It's. I'm fed up. I can't. I don't have the means to drive to the suburbs and wreak havoc there. And but the best I can do is I can destroy my neighborhood as an outpouring of protest because of this extreme injustice. Right? It's difficult for those of us on the outside looking in to really grasp that. I've tried for years to try to put it in a framework of what would drive me to a point where I would just literally destroy my neighborhood, right? And I can't come up with anything that would push me that far. I really can. Uh, I don't think any of us can really. Maybe we should give a deeper thought to that. But the riotous piece, yes, I get it. I'm not condoning violence. I'm not advocating violence, but there's a reason why these things happen, right? And that speaking about George Floyd and that whole movement, peaceful protest, and there was some rioting that went on there too, right? I mean, the media would call it rioting, right? But it was just us saying we have to be heard. We can no longer sit silent and not, you know, let this
That's the
pass.
thing. It's when you have something to say, but for so long, no one will listen to you and you're
Right.
not being heard. It's like, well, is this, it's kind of like Russell Crowe in Gladiator, like shouting out, like, are you not entertained type of thing.
Fair point.
Not that they're trying to be entertaining, but it's like, will you pay attention to me now that I've done this? Because
Right.
you weren't paying attention to me before.
Right.
And this is the only thing that will get you to pay attention to me. And also, when it comes to destroying your own neighborhood, I mean, you have to think about if you live in a place where your neighborhood is not really a neighborhood.
Nope.
Because of reasons that are entirely outside of yourself. You were born in this place and you can't control where you're born. You can't control when you're 6 years old. You can't pick up and move when you're 6 years old. This is where you've lived your whole life. And so when your neighborhood is already in a state where all around you, you look around and you see, oh my gosh, like I'm not valued, because if I was valued, then things would be taken care of better and all of this. So it's like, if your neighborhood's not actually a neighborhood to begin with, then there's a little bit less of a feeling, or I can imagine there's a little bit less of a feeling or like attachment to the actual structures of that place. Like you're connected to your hometown, and I think everyone's kind of connected to their hometown in a certain way, but I don't know. I think there's a lot of pain there as well. And I can see how people would get to that place. And again, maybe that's because I'm not strictly speaking a pacifist, but yeah. And I remember I went to, I mean, I'm not someone where I frequent the parts of Chicago that are quote unquote more dangerous, because I'm not scared of them, and I think it's important to see things that are different. But in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder, when all of the protesting was going on and the looting and everything, I went to that area where it was happening, the part of Chicago where all of that was going on, and I helped clean up and everything. But I got to talk to so many different people. I got to talk to police officers who were incredibly mad at what people were doing. Got to talk to police officers that were empathetic and understood. I got to talk to people that lived there that were like, why are we destroying our own neighborhood? And they didn't understand it. And I talked to other people that lived there, and they were like, this place is a shithole anyway. So like, as long as you don't mess with my stuff, do whatever you want. There were so many different perspectives from the people that I talked to in the immediate aftermath of his murder and while the protesting was going on. And so, again, kind of going back to what I said about this movie, I think that we need to understand that every response to anything comes from somewhere. And I like that this movie shows the perspective of African-American people who are enraged by how they've been treated, and they have to rise up. And this group rises up through music that, depending on how you look at it, incites violence. I don't necessarily fully agree with that, but some people might. But yeah, I just think it's important to, in everything, look at everyone's perspective and imagine, like, if I were in their scenario, how would I react, and not just judge from the outside. And I feel like this movie does a really good job of helping people who might not otherwise be able to put themselves in the scenario of this type of person from this community. It helps people do that. And that's one of the things I love about cinema. And I remember Geneva and I were talking about this when we were planning the podcast. What are things we love about movies? And one of them was movies help us access the realities of other people that we otherwise would not be able to access and understand. And I feel like this movie is a really good example of that. Anyway, thank you everybody for coming to my TED Talk.
But very, very well said.
Thank you. I'm writing a book. No, I'm not. So, okay, I'm going to push forward because we need to start wrapping things up. So, as we mentioned earlier, this film was only nominated for one Academy Award, which was Best Original Screenplay, which was written by all white people. So that's fun. Although that's not me shaming white people at all. White people are very talented. They can write very good scripts. I'm not anti-white person, but it's
right,
just upsetting that this, yeah, it's like this movie has such powerful performances by Black actors that before this movie weren't really known. And these were like their breakout roles. But after these movies, they kind of disappeared for a while because they weren't recognized. Anyway.
Yeah, it's absolutely ridiculous that this didn't launch O'Shea Jackson Jr. and Corey Hawkins and Jason Mitchell to, just a string of, Oscar-winning movie after Oscar-winning movie or whatever, however they wanted their careers to look. I mean, they're, they've all gone on to do good work, but yeah, give them all the world.
Yes. Yes. And so the movie also has been received fairly well by critics. So on Metacritic, it holds a score of 72. And then on Rotten Tomatoes, it is 89% fresh. And there was one critic review that I wanted to read because I feel like it kind of, it shows kind of the different sides of things of, yes, the members of this rap group, in some ways, they are problematic, and also in ways that weren't necessarily captured and portrayed in this movie. But at the same time, it's the message that matters. So this is a review from John DeFore from The Hollywood Reporter from 2015, the year that this movie came out. And it says, if the movie pushes most of the ugliest behavior off onto side players, like the notorious Suge Knight, played by R. Marcus Taylor, it does for the most part fulfill its mission, breathing life into the origin story of a group whose influence is still being felt. And so I like how that excerpt from that review kind of touches on, this movie does kind of, it doesn't touch on certain things about the group that might be more problematic. It kind of pushes that on other characters and highlights it more in them. But at the same time, the movie does do something important by breathing life into just these people and their influence on just American culture and music and things like that. So, yeah. And I think we've already kind of touched on the legacy of the movie. So I think we can move forward a little bit, and I'll just share for me the reason why I picked this movie and what aspect of the movie really did it for me, what cemented the movie in my mind and heart. This is probably a cliche answer of like, oh my gosh, out of this whole movie, this was the scene that really got you, the most emotional one, blah, blah, blah. And yes, I was manipulated. That's fine. I was emotionally manipulated. But the scene that really did it for me was the one when Tyreek, Dre's younger brother, dies. You find out that he died, and Dre kind of gets out of the tour bus and he's on the side of the street, and all of the men come around him and they just really support him, and they really are just like brothers. They're like a family in that moment. And I just thought that was really beautiful, how these men who in a certain light can be seen as very outspoken, very intense, very aggressive in certain ways, but they also can be really tender and really caring at the same time. And I loved how they there aren't really very many tender moments in this movie. But I love that they added this in there, and I thought it was beautiful. So, Geneva, no pressure for you if you don't have anything to say, but is there anything in this movie that really like did it for you, or is it kind of like, oh no, just enjoyed it?
I think, I mean, I talked about already the scene in which they're harassed by the police outside the recording studio, and there's that sort of standoff where multiple things are happening at once because it's them, it's the white officers, it's the one black officer, it's Jerry, and they're all kind of having this confrontation, and then that confrontation is what leads directly into Ice Cube writing "Fuck the Police." And I thought that that whole sequence worked really well. I think that's going to stick with me for a long time. And then I think there's just, some individual scenes here and there that are going to stick with me. But that's the one that immediately comes to mind.
How about you, Francis? Is there any particular moment or aspect of this film that really just kind of stands out for you as something special?
I'm going to keep it simple and just, it's my second time watching it. The first time I was just captivated by the individual performances, and knowing that I was parading about in a bucket hat that had N.W.A. straight out of Compton on it. I had no clue who they were or what they stood for. So I had to reconcile that the first time. But I'm gonna rest on just the soundtrack. It is arguably one of the best movie soundtracks that has ever been compiled. But that's just, again, it's biased, but I'm going with it.
Yeah. It's not biased. It's just your opinion. That's okay. Yeah. Okay. Well, I just want to say thank you to my father for joining us today. It was lovely to have him as our first guest.
Hopefully we can do it again sometime. It was fun. It went quick.
Yeah,
my gosh, it went quick.
I told my dad before, I was like, yeah, it might be 2 hours. He was like, 2 hours. I was like, believe me, it'll go by fast.
It always does. Yeah.
Geneva said the same thing before we started doing this. I'm like, because I make movies, so like I know that things always take way longer than you think. But both of them before, they were like, "Is it really good?" I'm like, "Yes, it is."
I know. It's like, how are we going to have enough thoughts to fill the time?
I was like, Geneva, we could talk for 5 hours. But anyway, speaking of talking about movies for a long time, Geneva, can you tell us what movie we're going to be discussing next week?
Yeah, well, speaking of movies in which the theme of rebellion against oppression and injustice is dealt with, we are going to go to a vastly different time period and cultural context, but possibly still see some similar themes. But we are going to be talking about the 1930, oh gosh, I always forget to look up the years before I say this.
38.
What did you say? 38,
1938, yeah.
Thank you. The 1938 film, The Adventures of Robin Hood, which is one of my all-time favorites.
It's not the Men in Tights version.
What'd you say?
It's not the Men in Tights version, right?
I said the same
They are in
thing.
tights. It is not the comedy Men in Tights, which is also a movie I love. It's kind of a guilty pleasure of mine.
Yes.
But yes, no, this is the original Errol Flynn version. Well, I shouldn't say original because there were versions of it before that. But, the Errol Flynn, Olivia de Havilland, some beautiful Technicolor. So, Tatum, have you seen this movie before? Have I forced you to watch this movie?
I will reveal that next week.
Oh, all right. TBD. Tune in.
Nice.
It's a cliffhanger for the listeners.
Yes. A little stressed out now because I love this movie, but I guess we'll find out.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that does it for us today. Thank you to Francis for being here. And as always, thank you to my partner in crime, Geneva, for being here. And yeah, we'll talk to you guys next week. Bye, everybody.
Well done. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at yourpickpod@gmail.com. Our theme song was composed by Joel Rushton, and our podcast graphic was designed by Kara Shin. If you like this show and want to hear more, please rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. We're so excited to have you on this journey with us. Until next time.